This is some good bonus seats. So if you do want to come up here, we're having a panel afterwards, but you know, you're welcome to come. You're welcome to come. So rather than a sort of formal presentation, we thought we'll just have a chat and you can all watch. Let's see how it goes. So Tayshan, delighted to have you here. You set up Grow to Know, which is a CIC based in North Kensington in London, where you grew up, right? Can you give us all a bit of a backstory on the organisation?
Yeah, I mean, massive pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, always beautiful to be up in Manchester. As I always say that I'm in a bubble in London. I never get outside of London. So even at a young age, just London was all I knew, and it probably explains a lot about all the noise in my mind. But I think, yeah, what catalyzed me into the work that I'm doing was the Grenfell Tower fire. So I'm born and raised in North Kensington, Ladbroke Grove, and kind of just grew up quite passively. My mum was an amazing woman of the community. So walking down Portobello Road, we bump into literally everyone, and it would take like 3 hours to get down one road, which was an inconvenience to me as a youngster. But now I do the same thing. So I've got 2 kids, and I take 10 hours to get down the road. So. But then you realise that these things are super important in places that we grow up, and you realise the change in landscape. So in 2017, I was an aspiring footballer. I was playing for a team in Austria called Kitzbühel, which people may know as a skiing resort, but they'd suddenly thought about football and wanted to get their football team to a decent level. And we just won the league. And I was in Austria at the time, and I remember receiving an odd amount of messages and calls in the late hours of the 14th. And there was just unfolding images of a fire which you would think would be contained, which then quickly engulfed the whole building. And at that point, I was like, I need to get back home. And when I got home, I came back to chaos. And you know, mothers not knowing where their children are, you know, friends looking for their friends. Everyone was there was just missing posters all over the community, and hope that the people that they couldn't find had made it to a hospital or had made it somewhere safe. And as you all know, that 72 lives were lost that night. And I very quickly went from someone who just cared about kicking a ball around a pitch to then really trying to unpick and unpack what happens, why did this injustice happen, and what part do I play in that? Could that have been me? And why were these people consequenced in the place that you're meant to call home, right? It's the safest space that you're meant to be in. And so I've just been on that journey since 2017, took to the streets in protest with the local community, a lot of elders leading that front, and then stumbled into this barren bit of land in under the Westway, a place called Maxilla, where people would congregate, they'd come together, and would you know, this was a safe space for the community. And this barren bit of land was it was unloved, it was unkempt, and we just decided to start off by doing some litter picking, and that for some reason turned into then asking local garden centres for plants. And then someone told me, oh, this is guerrilla gardening. I thought they were talking about zoo animals. and I just went on this journey of just absorbing all this information from people who would stand side by side with me, you know, sharing conversations. Oh, did you know this building used to be this? Did you know that this happened here? And when you come to realise that your community is really at the heart of everything that happens, and the people that came before me who then, you know, took a stand. North Kensington has this rich history, culturally, historically, of injustice, but also creativity in the face of adversity. And that's why it's such a vibrant place to live in now. And that's why a lot of people with a lot of money want to come and live in my community, not realising they're actually displacing the thing that they're moving in to try and be a part of. And so, like, when you think about Notting Hill Carnival, so I know I'm going off on one here, but think about Notting Hill Carnival, and a lot of people have reduced that to just a big party on the street, but actually that comes from a real place of adversity where Caribbean communities, so like Notting Hill was known as the slums in the 60s. Notting Hill and Brixton were kind of like the main places that a lot of migrant communities came to stay in. And so, like, when you start to really think about the history of why why I live where I live and why I'm from where I'm from, what I identify with, the experiences that I had growing up. My mum was a single mother to 4 of us in a council house, and she was amazing. You know, she did everything she could to give us all the resources, all the tools. All of that, 3 of us got scholarship to private school, which again, like when thinking about like my lived experience, is like all of these things that I was exposed to gave me a broader understanding of how different people live and how different people have access to different things. You know, I went to for 2 years. I went to state primary school and then went to prep school for 2 years, and I was going to school unknowingly with artists and musicians, like children of, going round to their house, but they would never come round to ours, and now I know why. But I think that was a really important kind of part of my experience and understanding. Okay, well, there is this kind of disparity. There is this inequality, and I think in the community that I live in, it's so contrasting. You know, we've got Grenfell Tower right next to the David Beckhams and the Simon Cowells, literally within a stone throw away. And so, like, for me, it's just I've gone on a really long-winded journey of how. For me, it's just like how do we expose and create awareness to the privilege that people, institutions, like spaces have, and how do we then not see it as a negative to then redistribute that and to create more access, create more opportunity, and connect all of the dots? Because on the surface, when you walk down the street in Ladbroke Grove, it doesn't matter whether you're a millionaire or someone who's grown up in a council house or what from work, you know, you'll say hi to each other and you'll catch up over a coffee, or, you know, these things aren't spoken. But then I guess when you then do speak them, I think then it becomes more meaningful. And yeah, sure, it makes a bit of, you know, discomfort, and, you know, we do cause a bit of mischief, but I think that's important. I think the freedoms and the opportunities I have now wouldn't be the case if it wasn't for people that came before me who were like, hold on a second, that doesn't feel right, that doesn't seem right. We're going to take a stand here. We're going to sacrifice some of our privilege, some of our luxuries to be able to give other people that. So
I'm a big fan of mischief myself. I saw a lot of heads nodding when mischief was going on there. That's good. And a lot of heads nodding, actually. You can see, you know, folk are resonating with lots of different bits of that, Tayshan. So I'm glad you went off on different avenues. It's important to cover those things. So, you know, we've got a room full of community folks who work in community organisations, and that's probably why you're seeing a lot of nods when you were talking there. But not everyone, I guess, sees themselves as an activist. And you definitely do, right? And why do you see this work? And, you know, people often think of growing vegetables or growing plants. You know, what's that? How's that being an activist? Why do you see that, seeing yourself as being an activist, and why do you see it as important?
Because I think it's so easy, and it's so easy to reduce the work that we do to some flowery, floaty thing that doesn't centre around people, and it doesn't centre around social justice. It's the intersectionality of the work that we all do that I think is at the heart and is key. And I think the more that we speak on it, the more that we can expose the opportunities when it comes to kind of health inequalities, when it comes to community cohesion, intergenerational connection, when it comes to like isolation, mental health, physical health. These are all things that are so intersectional with land justice, with food growing, food security, the opportunities that gardens, green space, nature brings to communities and people. And I think that obviously in Ladbroke Grove, that's exposed more than most places, because there's so much going on in such a small space. It's so densely populated. It's people from all different walks of life, from all different ages, all different backgrounds, coexisting in one place. And so you then really do see the kind of different connections between all of these different things. But it's really not to be undervalued. And I think now's the time to really start speaking on how kind of land and capacity and green space has the opportunity to kind of really change a nation. I think it is so easy to kind of like reduce it to bees and butterflies. And I think that's the journey that I found myself falling into, the kind of commercialization, the commodification of nature, where, you know, yeah, TV, books, all of that stuff is like, yeah, at their convenience. We're not talking about very uncomfortable things that impact real people in really difficult places. And yeah, that is going to create discomfort, but that's going to then create benefit for not just myself, not just you, but for everyone. So I think, we need to have those uncomfortable conversations, which I don't think are actually uncomfortable. I think they're just real and they're normal. I think we should just normalize, having a conversation about people's mental health in relation to spatial intervention, or in relation to biodiversity, and making all these connections, joining up all the dots. Just to give an example, and sorry if I'm going over time here, I'm not sure if I am, but in the 60s, and I'll speak about Notting Hill being the slums in the 60s, right? And so it's no coincidence that an idea from New York, actually by a town planner called Robert Moses. So in New York in the 50s, there was this kind of war between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. Robert Moses being the town planner, and Jane Jacob being kind of like part of the community and someone who would take a stand against these expressways being built in what they called across the slums. And the Westway was the only one, so that there was a whole plan for London to be filled with kind of motorways on stilts. And the Westway was the only one that was actually brought to life. And it's because all of the middle class communities in all the other parts of London resisted those expressways because they knew that would affect their health. But people in Notting Hill and Ladbroke Grove didn't have a say. So you've got the Westway, which has 96,000 cars driving overhead every day. Then when you put that into kind of like the data around health inequalities here and today, someone who lives where I live can expect to live 20 years on average less than someone who lives in Holland Park, which is just about 0.5 miles away. And so this is something that I should be a part of the conversation. Social engineering, like why were things designed the way? People sat round tables at different junctions and said, yes, that's what was meant for them, and that's what's meant for those other people there, which then has had a long-term impact and will continue to have an impact unless we intervene. So I'm really interested in conversations around spatial intervention. It's all good and well having a beautiful comms campaign which gets the excitement of everyone, which is really important to have hand in hand with also kind of like land justice, kind of reclaiming space and rooting that space in people and plants, hand in hand. So I can't remember your question.
You got there. Listen, a flower bed's not going to make your kids' school better, or do the shopping for you, or address the situation of your energy bills, or address social cohesion in a place, is it? Unless those other elements exist, right? So that's really important. I did have another question, but I think we will. Well, I'll tell you what. If you can answer it in a line, Tayshan, let's see what we can do, right? And then we'll move on to our next speaker, Rachel. I think it's worth saying out loud that the green sector has been very slow to adapt to recognise those issues that you've raised there. So I think it's important to say this out loud. And there has been some change, a little bit, incremental little bits here and there, little sprinklings, maybe a little too much of the comms stuff that you're talking about. This is a tricky one to answer in one line. What further work do you think is necessary? One line, okay? 2 lines.
I think really just speaking to that redistribution of resource, power, wealth, which will have impacts on the people that need it the most, and that will take the likes of National Trust, the likes of the RHS, the likes of any institution, governmental body to really take a stand. And there will be discomfort, there will be compromise, and I think that's the important part. Is we all have to be willing to compromise in some way. I realize the privileges that I have, even though my privileges are not, that exciting. I live quite a simple life, but I realize the leverage that I might have in the media, for example, in some ways. I realize the connections that I've built through the work that I do. And it's how can I use that access to benefit a wider community of people and not hoard it and not go, because it would be, it'd be so easy for me to set up a garden design company in Notting Hill, and engage all the Simon Cowells and David Beckhams and do all of that stuff and of personal benefit. But that doesn't serve me, and that doesn't serve the people who came before me, who took a stand and who put themselves at risk, a lot more at stake for them. And you think, sorry, this is more than one line, but just to I guess a segue into what's to come next. We've launched a campaign called Closing the Green Gap, which hasn't been announced. It has been announced, but it hasn't been announced quite yet. And how we're working with the National Trust, definitely with my ambassadorial hat on, but also as someone who's rooted in North Kensington who's lived North Kensington, so like it's very hyper local. And I think like taking that knowledge and then putting it into space, helping, supporting other people in your area, I think are really important. So closing the green gap is kind of our next steps in how we address that.
Brilliant. Everyone, please give up for Tayshan. Amazing answers.